A very good afternoon to you. Welcome to The Full View. It's a pleasure to have you with us. My name is Bongwe.
And I'm Fundo Mabalani. Indeed, it is a pleasure to have you with us. Welcome to our special coverage of the first parliamentary seating. At least you can see there that what has happened thus far is that Togo Didiza has been elected Speaker. Now with that, we're now seeing a bit of a suspension where most will now begin to vote for the two candidates. The two candidates that we have currently is Anlilo Treat, and we also have ATM's Violetu Zungula. But we're not alone this evening. We are joined by our guest, Professor Booysen, as well as Dr. Sithembile Mbete to my right.
And of course, just as we're watching these developments that are unfolding in the National Assembly for you, it's interesting that just before the breakaway from that particular session there, we then are hearing, some chants of Umtengisi. And this, of course, speaks to just how disgruntled others are about the turn of events. You think about the fact that, earlier on, the leader of the Democratic Alliance, John Steenhuisen, updating addressing the nation, as he called it, to be able to give a sense of where the Democratic Party, the Democratic Alliance, in fact, is moving towards, and then also talking about that they're now going to be discussing policy. A lot of people saying, oh, so now we have a bit more information from the opposition about this potential arrangement that we could see unfold.
Quite interesting what we heard from John Steenhuisen, because essentially what he stated was that there is a signing of a statement of intent, but beyond this there's going to be a far more comprehensive conversation that is had around the policy, which is what we'll probably try to delve into with all of you, of whether that is actually how it should be, because there could be a lot of clashes when it comes to policy. One would assume that perhaps you'd put it at the very beginning as well. So it will be interesting to hear your views on some of what John Steenhuisen and the other political parties yesterday briefed us on.
And, I think we should just also get into this conversation, Funda, because, you'd remember on the show, we've been talking about foreign policy and what then does it mean as they're now going to be working together. Prof, they're coming from different sides and different parts of the room. So are they then able to formulate this particular policy? So before we even get into the policy discussion, Dr. Mbete, I'm going to start with you. We're listening to a session of the National Assembly, the first sitting, that is, of the 7th administration, and already we're hearing words like Umtengisi. What does it tell us about what the House is going to look like in this administration?
Well, look, it's not as if we've had a calm House in the last...
and a number of people are hoping it might be different.
The last, I think, two, the 5th Parliament and the 6th Parliament were incredibly robust. I don't know that we've had a completed State of the Nation address, or a State of the Nation address that started at the time that it was scheduled to start in, 10 years. And so, there's nothing completely different in what we're seeing now, but of course what is different is the political dynamics and kind of the balance of power within the National Assembly, which has changed so differently after this election. And we are seeing, I think, the manifestations of that, and certainly with the calls of Umtengisi, a response to the ANC's decision to go into a government of national unity, or they're calling it a government of national unity with the Democratic Alliance, and that being seen as a betrayal, perhaps, of the ANC's own history and identity and ideology.
Doctor, I could see you actually were struggling with the term government of national unity versus broad coalition, because it seems as though you were tempted to actually take it there, because many have said a rose by any other name is still a rose. That what they're seeing here is in fact a broad or grand coalition because of the lack of the legislative framework that governed the previous 1994 GNU.
Look, I think that we could have a GNU even in the absence of that legislative framework. However, what has at least come out today, and because we've only heard the pronouncement from John Steenhuisen of the DA, we haven't heard from the ANC what their view is of this arrangement, is that the two dominant parties within it are going to be the ANC and the DA. We've heard the IFP yesterday say that they would be part of it as well, and so the three members of the original government Government of National Unity. We've heard also of the PA being involved, but you know, the parameters of this agreement are still quite, you know, loose. So we haven't had confirmation of all of them from all of the parties that are involved in terms of the document that was set out today. And so, you know, and whether there will be a framework similar to that we had for the original GNU, I think is a big question. But this does seem to be a grand coalition by any other name.
And Prof, I'm keen to hear your thoughts, and welcome, Tammy, to our viewers. Of course, Thamsanqa Malusi, the attorney and legal analyst, who will be helping us at least try to make sense of some of the legalities that might emerge for all of you. But, Prof, earlier on in the day, about some 20-30 minutes before the actual sitting, Helen Zille, the federal leader of the Democratic Alliance, is speaking to Mzwandile Beja, our colleague, saying that, you know, an agreement at the moment, we're still working at it. There's that last paragraph that we're still waiting for. And if that last paragraph is not ironed out, I'm afraid we may not have an agreement. What does that tell us about how difficult or, you know, the atmosphere as these political parties would have been talking, and how possibly difficult it would have been?
Yes, it was indeed very difficult. We've heard reports that negotiations continued into the period when the sitting of Parliament had actually started, a little bit into that. In the last few hours, by about lunchtime, late lunchtime, I did see a version of the statement of intent signed by both the ANC and by Helen Zille. Both those signatures were already on it. And beyond that, I think this agreement is also holding wider. If we look at the vote, for the Speaker in National Assembly now, that 284, that means probably the ANC, DA, IFP, NFP, PA, Freedom Front plus 6 other votes had voted in that pattern. If we look at the results for the Speaker in KZN, we see that that pattern is holding. So that's fascinating. That disagreement, yes, it is taking shape. I think it's very formal at this stage. I don't know exactly which of the other parties are in there, but I can see by these two sets of voting that the IFP is definitely in there as well and is holding across the provinces. And that's very important, especially for the ANC. And we know the NEC, I've heard good reports, the NEC that was held last night was very divided. But still then, this kind of vote means that the ANC members, caucuses, have adhered to the agreement and they're running with it.
Quite interesting.
Thamsanqa, perhaps to rope you in here on the legalese. We're talking about a statement of intent. And now this is completely different to what we saw with the Government of National Unity back in 1994, because there, as we were stating, there was legislative framework, specifically Clause 88 spoke to the existence of this kind of a governing structure. But here we have a statement of intent, not necessarily all that much convincing that indeed they'll enter into something even more concrete. Like they say, if anything, it's probably still in the air. It's just a statement that we will get into some sort of an agreement, but pending fulfillment of certain things. Your take on just this statement?
Yeah, I think, as you put it, you know, in the interim constitution, there was a specific provision that provided for, you know, a coalition government, you know, or a government of national unity, as you put it. And I think the specific provision was 88, and where it said that if you get 20 seats in Parliament, you get to have control of one department within the government. That was a product, obviously, of CODESA, and the interim constitution obviously provided for elections and all other things. And other things that it provided for actually was the establishment of the new constitution, which is what we have currently. Now, the current constitution does not provide for a government of national unity. What it says is the National Assembly elects the president then elects his cabinet. There's nothing within the framework of the existing constitution that provides for a government of national unity. Now, you might have a statement of intent, but that will never override what the constitution provides for. So you may well have a situation where the parties do agree on the formation of a government, but if President Cyril Ramaphosa, assuming that he will be the president, decides that he wants to change things as he sees,
beyond
the constitution gives him that
prerogative.
So it's not the statement of intent that gives him that.
I suppose then one could then be saying, so how much of it can then possibly be upheld, because if the prerogative lies with him and he makes certain decisions, and you even hear of John Steenhuisen and even earlier on admitting that yes, we will back the president, but it's his prerogative at the end of the day when it comes to cabinet and everything else, then that is assigned to him.
Yeah, it all comes down to good faith, really. And I think one of the things, I haven't had sight of the statement of intent, but I've seen some versions, some snippets from it. And I think one of the things that is provided there is good faith, you know, and that's all that they can rely on, because there's no legal document that will be binding on the president to force him to do as the statement of intent provides for, or as a framework agreement that will eventually be agreed between the political parties will provide. The Constitution is what is overriding here, and nothing else can override the Constitution.
So it means for those South Africans that have said it's a grand coalition, they're not being cynical. If we have to go by your interpretation legally, then it's not necessarily a government of national unity, even though it's called that. Doctor, perhaps to bring it back to you now, to just what happened today. We saw the election of Thoko Didiza as Speaker. I just want to talk about the person of Thoko Didiza. She's no stranger. You saw she just swiftly got into that role. She's been a presiding officer. She's quite familiar with most of the politicians that are there, has had to at certain times calm the house down. Your views on just her candidacy when she was brought forward by the African National Congress?
I think she's been an excellent choice. She was the youngest member of Madiba's government in 1994. She has extensive experience in the National Assembly, you know, with Parliament, but also having been in Cabinet, and is an uncontroversial figure as an individual. So I think also somebody that was would have been easily agreed to by all the parties that are, you know, that are having negotiations on this governance arrangement. And so I think that, and in her temperament, in her, and I think we saw in the way that she was handling things with the election of the Deputy Speaker and the nominations process, I think is the right person to have in this role. And I think we'll be able to manage some of the complexities that will emerge, certainly because for the first time we're going to have a Deputy Speaker that's not from the largest party. It's no longer the dominant party or the majority party, but we're going to have a Deputy Speaker that comes from a different party to the Speaker. And that'll require a great deal of maturity and political maturity in order to manage. And I think that she's the right person as an individual to manage that kind of process.
Prof, let me stay with, you know, the developments around the Democratic Alliance, especially when you listen to their leader just delivering that particular statement of intent and the posture. But also, there's this one thing that he said which was quite striking, as he talks about how the times ahead, South Africans, could be very challenging. It certainly may not be, you know, a road that is easy, and speaks about the Lekgotla, speaks about the climate, speaks about the fact that right now, all they want to do is to make sure that it's, you know, what they're doing is best for the South African people. But he says the DA will be there with you, the people of South Africa, throughout this particular, you know, process. That also gives us an indication of a Democratic Alliance that is potentially aware that they may be in this for the long haul, because possibly, as Dr. Mbete says, the two big political parties may have reached agreements that are quite comfortable for them.
Yes, indeed. I think there is little doubt at this stage that the two big players here have reached that kind of agreement. And both the big parties then have to be very careful not to alienate their own constituencies, because the local government elections are just over 2 years away, and they're going to be judged all the way, not whether they perform in a long term or even the medium term, but in a short term. They try to warn that changes are not going to, and Steenhuisen also did that in his speech, that changes are not going to follow overnight. But people and the voters out there, and the cynical ones, are going to be very impatient and are going to be reminding their leaders who entered into this intent statement that they better deliver to their individual constituencies as well. That is very true, both for the DA and then for the ANC, where the ANC's own followers, we can hear that in the public narratives and the outcries, are not always sure, or almost never sure, it seems, that their party acted in their interest. So it's going to be a big and difficult road for the ANC, but a very important one to persuade their voters that, yes, this was in your interest, we're not selling out, we're not compromising on any significant values.
Thamsanqa, voting is currently underway, but I want to take you to the previous voting process. There was a bit of a back and forth where it was time now to count the votes with the Chief Justice. There was an issue that was raised by Booysen of the Economic Freedom Fighters, stating that for them it was foreign that you'd have a situation where the presiding officer would now take the ballot and the ballot box and go and count the votes privately and only come back to communicate the outcome. Something that even their own leader, Julius Malema, took exception to, actually saying he cannot believe that in democratic South Africa in 2024, there is even a debate with the Chief Justice as to whether you can have observers, because this is internationally acceptable that with any election you would have observers. He capitulated, but having stated that for him, these are rules that he found. His predecessor had, and everybody else had agreed to these rules. What did you make of just that exchange?
Yeah, so the Chief Justice presides over the first sitting of Parliament following an election of the National Assembly. And obviously the reason for that is that the previous Parliament would have been dissolved, and so there is no Speaker to preside over the sitting of Parliament. Now, one of the functions that he has in terms of the Constitution is, one, to preside, to swear the new members in, preside over the election of the Speaker, but in addition to that, he has a prerogative he can make rules for the election of the process for the election of the Speaker. So what he said is that, you know, he simply adopted previous rules that were there, he said they were there in 2019, and he thinks they were there in 2014 as well. And he says all he did was to amend the annexures, but nothing more of that. But he does have the powers to amend the rules for the election of the Speaker and the processes around the election of the President as well. So I think the point was valid that, you know, why are the votes being counted in secret? His response was equally valid that, you know, I got these rules when I arrived, but he does have the power to amend them because that is provided for him in the Constitution. But luckily sense prevailed, and that he allowed for observers to come in and watch the counting, which I think was a sensible thing to do in that moment, because there's no reason for these things to be shrouded in secrecy. It only creates conspiracy, which we don't need at this point.
So does it mean then, Thamsanqa, we're looking at maybe a potential relook of this particular, you know, process? Because if they are now, I mean, they've been MPs, they've seen this happen, but they keep on saying, no, we've seen votes being counted in our presence, but the Chief Justice, like you say, you know, expressing the fact that I didn't change anything. But now, what happens then, in your view, with these particular MPs? Because they've been there, so are they now likely to relook this particular process?
Well, I think it's a far reach, you know. The simple fix is for the Chief Justice to amend the rules that deal with the processes around the election of the Speaker in the new National Assembly, so that they can be done in public. I mean, he's not going to be around when the new election happens, so that's for the Justice Myers to think about. But I think if they were to amend, if the Parliament was to do something about it, it would mean that they would have to amend the Constitution, which is a far fetch for something as insignificant as this, which can be simply fixed by the amendment of the rules by the Chief Justice himself.
So I suppose, Mfundo, the process, you know, one thinks about it, and I'm actually chuckling as Thamsanqa was talking, because these are MPs that would have been in that house.
Yes,
for so long.
And that was stated, that most of them know that even when Mmusi Maimane was still MP, but a representative from the Democratic Alliance, this happened, and they were counted in front of everybody. But now, I mean, the agreement that was reached was that the whips or the representatives, because there are no whips per se right now, was that the representatives at the very least can go and observe while the presiding officer is counting. But I suppose they do need to finally have it written. So it would probably be important. I see, Professor, you've got something to say that you want to squeeze in something pertaining to that.
Yes, for me, these objections today are so indicative of the change in political culture and change in party political culture that we've experienced in South Africa. We saw it in elections gradually arising over the last about 1 decade. But gradually small political parties come in, they challenge the rules, new ones come in, and the IEC people reflected on that too, saying that they just don't have that general assumed automatic goodwill of political parties now anymore that they used to have 2 decades ago. Now they're accepting and expecting that each step of the way they will be critiqued, they will be scrutinized, and this culture has now spilled over into Parliament as well.
It's going to be an interesting road ahead.